I've had a few slides put up for a discussion. We'll come to those in a second. These are data on unemployment rates for in the aggregate and for youth, using an OECD definition for OECD countries. I just put that up there so you can see you probably can't read that, but Spain is certainly the world's record holder at this point for unemployment. You can't see it? No, you can't hear it. Oh, you can't hear it? Well, I'm going to have to get, how about if I lift it over here? So let me say it again. I've put that slide up there. I'll come back to it in a minute. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. These are unemployment rates in the OECD countries measured on a comparable basis, both for the aggregate economy and for youth, OECD definition. It doesn't matter too much how that's done, but I'll come back to those in a second because there are 2 or 3 more slides that go with them when I make a comment about the issue of labor market reform and how I think it's related to these numbers. The first point, though, I should make, I realize that there's a labor market reform going on here, or some alteration in how labor contracts are arranged. Many times people think about making those changes without having any reference to what alternative systems for governing employment relationships are. And often I think people have it in mind that what they're doing is moving closer to the U.S. system. The U.S. is probably considered the most flexible of all labor markets. Even though our unemployment rate is high, it's not as high as it is in Spain. There's a very important distinction between the way Europeans approach all litigation and employment relationships and the way Americans and British people do. And I'm always surprised when I teach in my graduate course, most Americans, and certainly no Europeans, know this. The difference is that the U.S. starts with a common law doctrine called the Employment-at-Will Doctrine. In other words, there is no law. The Employment-at-Will Doctrine says that anyone can fire anyone at any time for any or no reason, and that any employee can quit the job they're in at any time for any or no reason. That's the law. In other words, there is no law. That's what we start with. Now, I can hear the tinkling in the room. That's the shocking idea for a European. It's inconceivable. Now, there are 2 differences, of course. One, the Americans and English start with a common law structure for most economic relationships, and Europeans start with a government structure, all the way, certainly dating from Napoleon in the case of France, who more or less conquered every country anyway. So you're starting from different perspectives. But the idea of deregulation, if taken to its extreme, means you go to the American system. Now, the American system, of course, could never survive in the form I just described it. And you can see why. Suppose that you're the secretary of a company president who steals large amounts of money from the company, and you are called to testify in front of a courtroom about the information you have on your president's behavior, which is clearly illegal, and your president says to you, well, if you testify accurately to the court and follow your oath, then I'm going to fire you. That's completely legal under the old system. But we all know that we couldn't possibly have that. So there are exceptions to the Employment-at-Will Doctrine, one of which is called public interest exception, in which you can't ask someone to do something that's illegal and expect to be able to get away with firing them. And then the other exception is if you have an explicit contract. An explicit contract would be a trade union agreement with an employer that explicitly says that you can be fired only for cause. At one time, this was a fairly important part of the U.S. Employment scene. Today, in the private sector, there are effectively no unions. Unionization rate in the private sector is below 8%. In the public sector, so it's 95% is not covered. In the public sector, on the other hand, there is considerable unionization. But as I say, in the private sector, which is still by far the largest part of the U.S. employment scene, we really don't have unions. So that form of a contract protection doesn't exist. There are contracts, but they're only because employers voluntarily agree to them. The other big exception is laws that have been passed where it's apparent that their employment contracts are in violation of what people consider to be fundamental objectives, either fairness objectives or even efficiency objectives in the market, and those are firing someone because of their race or their sex or their national origin or something else. So there are equal employment opportunity laws. These vary from place to place that effectively put restrictions on what employers can do. Anyway, I mention that because a complete labor market reform, other than simply lowering wage rates or eliminating pensions, which appears to be the primary objective of the Spanish model, I think for most Europeans would be considered very, very difficult to do if you were trying to move toward the American system. Secondly, let me talk about the big. I leave to the others how to solve your unemployment problem. Instead, I wanted to mention something that is the main concern for labor economists. The biggest concern most of us have is that if you have unemployment for a long period, high unemployment for a long period, and it effectively rests primarily on the young, you lose an entire cohort who would have developed worker skills that if it goes on long enough, they will begin to lose. There's basically, the English labor economists are the best to here discuss this. There's a whole cohort associated with the Thatcher reforms in England that is considered to be kind of lost in British culture. And the concern anywhere would be if there's a youth unemployment that lasts for a very long time, there are all kinds of things one should learn that you don't learn. Now, one of the really interesting issues is, could some kind of reform in the labor market actually influence not necessarily the overall level of unemployment, which, as I say, I leave to these gentlemen to explain how it will be reduced, but could it do something that might help with the high levels of European, or anywhere actually, youth unemployment? So I put together this little chart. Now, there, that's just data. Now go to the second one. So that's just a graph of youth unemployment against aggregate unemployment. And you can see your country up here at the top with the highest in both youth and national unemployment, very high up there. I drew a regression line in there. I wanted to put the regression line. Now, I know for those who object to regression lines, there's at least one person at this table. I have even a third slide, or fourth. Can you go to the last one? Okay. In the last one, all I did, yes, that's a 45-degree line, so there's no regression. What I did is I expressed the unemployment rate relative, the aggregate unemployment rate in each of the OECD countries relative to the U.S. So let's take the U.S. as the benchmark. That's going to be our flexible labor market country. And let's do that for the unemployed aggregate, and let's do it for the unemployed youth. So what this does is just show you that the relationship of, so the 0.11 on this graph is the United States. And all the other points are the 45-degree line. The lesson you learn from this is the reason you have high youth unemployment in Spain is because you have high unemployment. That's the general lesson. In fact, it's a virtual universal fact that in the OECD countries, the youth unemployment rate is 2 times the overall unemployment rate. Now, it's deviations from this line that are the most interesting. And it would be especially interesting if, for example, Spain deviated from the line, but it doesn't. It's right on it. You have just exactly the youth unemployment that would be expected. If using the U.S. flexible labor market model, you have exactly the same unemployment as would be expected for youth as we would expect in the U.S. Now, there are some exceptions. Italy is above the line. So many of the discussions you hear about the segmentation of the Italian labor market, where the youth in particular have especially difficult times, this diagram is consistent with that. It's conceivable that there could be something that would reestablish a relationship, make this look more like what happens in our so-called US flexible labor market. Oddly, Sweden's above the line too, which is probably not something you'd expect. And Germany's a little low, which is maybe something you would expect. But the general point I want to make is that the concern I have about losing this cohort, if you have a recession that goes on for a very long time, probably will not be resolved by anything you can do in the reform of the labor market.